So everyone's here for migrating a monolith to cloud native, and the stumbling blocks you might not know about. Hi, I'm JJ, developer advocate for the IBM Cloud, and I really do have the email address of awesome@ibm.com. If you know anything about IBM, that is very impressive to get because IBM is not famous for giving good email addresses. And you can find me on Twitter at JJ Asghar. 9 out of 10 times, that's the easiest way to find me. I post random things. Also, I'm a streamer too. So if you like the way I present and the way I talk, you can see me more or less weekly doing cloud native things. And I have it also all up on YouTube too. So I've been told that I'm a whiteboard presenter. So I like interaction. I'm not going to just spit a bunch of stuff at you and put you to sleep after 45 minutes. I actually want interaction. So if I spur a thought or a question as I'm going along, please don't hesitate to raise your hand, and or for hell of it, just shout it out. And I'll repeat it for our audience at home, and we will have a conversation. Because I've been to enough conferences in my life where I've spent an insane amount of money and fallen asleep, and I do not want that for people who are enjoying my talks too. Can I get a thumbs up? Perfect. All right, cool. Already interacting. I like it. I'm also a coach for a small kids coach team, soccer team. So I do a lot of thumbs up to make sure people actually listen to me, or at least I used to. Anyway, long story short. So your company has finally decided to move to cloud native, the cloud native ecosystem. You've landed on containerization as your first step. You heard all you need to do was containerize your first app and then push it to Kubernetes, OpenShift, or Nomad even. And the cost savings will just come. You've done this, and well, things just haven't gone as well as planned. Some of the tech didn't do what you were expecting. And wait, what do you mean our OpEx has gone up? Simply said, the promise of containerization or migrating to the cloud native ecosystem can be a lie if you don't do your homework. And in this talk, I'll explain a few of those gotchas that a few enterprises in the guise of AsgharLabs hit towards moving to the cloud native world. And hopefully you learn from their mistakes. So as you take your trip down the same path, you'll be much more comfortable and not stumble on those same blocks. So first thing first, what is AsgharLabs? AsgharLabs is a multinational tech conglomerate brought hard into the VM ecosystem. They make ones and zeros like no other company, but they noticed they were falling behind. But in all seriousness, AsgharLabs is a collection of the different companies that I've worked with and had the privilege to work with as an IBM developer advocate. And the stories I've taken from different ones that I've seen consistencies with. Yes, AsgharLabs is a fake company. And no, they're not hiring. Again, another joke. It's always best when you have to point out your jokes. I hear that's the best way to do it. So what did AsgharLabs think they had to do? They thought they could take their migration from the physical data center or co-location to the VM ecosystem and use the exact same technique move their monolithic applications to cloud native. Bare metal to VMs is the same as VMs to containers, right? Not a single person shook their head. I'm surprised. There we go. No, I got one person saying yes. So you're in the right place, sir. So where do I come into these conversations normally? I come into this conversation when AsgharLabs think they've made a few successful migrations, which honestly I beg to differ. They're nowhere near where they thought they could be, and have how much effort and time and effort they've put in to get to where they are. I come in as the cloud native person and ask some simple, very tough questions. And guess what? Let's ask those questions now. These look very straightforward and simple, but they're deceptively hard to answer. The first question is, who actually containerized your app? Was it the developers or the operations team? Was there more than a couple status meetings, AsgharLabs, between the project teams and when y'all shipped it? Did you actually have collaboration back and forth between it? You've got to know who spent the time to what they did, who containerized it. Next, why? Honestly, why? I've asked this question to multiple companies before, and I've gotten whole slews of answers. One of AsgharLabs' subsidiaries containerized because they were told to. Their CIO read something in a magazine saying that containerization is the future, and we want to be next gen. So guess what? We're containerizing our application. Well, really? Like, come on. If you're in the black already, why spend the time to refactor? And I'll get into that deeper in a minute. I saw that exact same thing back in the day with VM, from co-location to VMs, where the CEO was on a trip. I actually worked at this company, was on a trip and was like, we need to go to the cloud. So let's rip everything out of our Windows-based application and move to Rackspace. Rackspace is OpenStack, only uses Linux. Oh, it's Ruby, it'll work. It didn't work. Next question is, where are you planning on deploying, or where have you deployed your containerized app? This spurs from so many different conversations, but it's a really hard question to ask. Are you using the cloud that is best for your application? Or was it forced down some ELA that you might have, right? Like, are you just been told that you had to use A, B, and C, IBM Cloud, out there to be able to do what you need? You should use IBM Cloud because it's the best. Anyway, or are you forced to use it for some other reason? You really should do your homework to find out where you're going to deploy that application. OpenShift. You should use OpenShift. So, and the final question I always ask is, what did you actually containerize? Really? Like, do you actually know what's in your containers that you're running? The operations team sitting there, do they know what application is there, or is it just a container to them? If you're having these conversations, or it's all situational awareness. This comes from the actual architecture that you've containerized. One of AsgharLabs companies thought they could just take a WAR file. Honestly, it could have been an EAR file, but they took a WAR file, shoved it into a Java container, Docker container, and then called it a day. This opened up so many conversations with that company. And actually, Pratik, if you're in this room, you're not? Oh, okay. We were actually on those same calls together. And it was really weird because it wasn't doing what they expected, because they thought the promise of containerization, they could just treat it like a VM, but they weren't leveraging Kubernetes for what it was. So let's take a quick aside and go into some of those architectural changes you're going to make as you move into the cloud native ecosystem. So of course I work at IBM, so I have to have WebSphere somewhere. Another joke. So the very first step is usually the replatform, and that's what that company thought about doing, where they could just take their legacy application, shove it into a container, and then push it on Kubernetes or OpenShift. Always OpenShift. So, that was replatforming. You take your application. It's the first step, right? It's important for your first step. I say first step because the next step is moving towards microservices. Well, you start breaking up your application. So if you had that EAR file with a bunch of WARs inside of it, now you can move each of those WAR files into different pods, excuse me, different pods. And then now you start having microservices. You start having shared contracts and shared APIs between the applications, so they can start talking to one another. And that's great, but this is only the next step. The final step is actually refactoring your application. And I'm using that term very specifically because you are going to have to refactor your application. It is that simple. You cannot just take your container, shove in, or your application, shove in a container and call it a day. You have to use most likely the strangler pattern. And of course, my throat's starting to bother me. You're going to have to use the strangler pattern to start shaving off bits and pieces of your application into smaller microservices. Now, does everyone know what the strangler pattern is? Or better yet, who does not know what the strangler pattern is? Okay, so it's an overloaded term, but the easiest way to describe it is you have an application, a monolithic application, right? I have a horrible example, so bear with me, but it kind of explains it. You're running some shop online, right? During the normal part of the year, you make sales, you get receipts for PDFs, right? Well, on, as you start building up your application and refactoring it, let's say you need to do some OCR on those receipts for returns, right? Because you never know what's going to happen. So you figure out the features of that OCR and you build it beside your application as its own service, right? So it's instead of, and you shave it off of your application and do its own service. You strangle your major monolithic service down by features, slowly, slowly, slowly. So over time, your main application becomes smaller and smaller and smaller, and all your features become microservices. And that's the strangler pattern in a nutshell. So imagine if you had to do the OCR part, you have the OCR application running side by side of your main application. And as soon as it finishes and does the work you need to, then you can actually remove that code from your main application. Does that make sense? Got a thumbs up? Perfect. So strangler pattern is the refactor process that's most likely you're going to be most successful with, because you leverage the microservices of the OCR in that case, and you have your actual application running side by side for a good amount of time where you feel confident enough, then you can just remove that code from the main one. Cool. So where are the actual advantages of going through all these steps? Because 9 out of 10 times, if you're on this path, if you're about to start this path, or you've gone down it, obviously your management's going to ask at some point, like, we've just wasted X number of $1 million on engineering. Where are the advantages? And honestly, what are the disadvantages? The main advantage, simply said, is velocity. The ability to focus on their own histories and scoping the clusters to what they actually need. The ability to take, when you start using that strangler pattern in microservices, you'll be able to allow yourself to do multiple releases a day. No longer do you have to wait every 6 months to update that jar file or WAR file for that matter. Now you can actually just focus on that OCR for your feature set and roll out new versions whenever you need to. But on the flip side, the disadvantage is it requires a higher level of cooperation. And you'll need to build out more advanced integration tests, along with most likely a completely different way to deploy your application. This is a huge cultural change that every company has to figure out a way to do it. And it can't be mandated. And I'll get into deeper details in a moment. So I didn't realize this term was specific to the company I was working at in the past called Dell Technologies. But there was a term called the CCB. The CCB is the change control board. So what do you mean our goal is to move away from the CCB or change control board? You've probably seen releases done somehow, right, with operations and production teams. Well, the CCB, at least at Dell, was based literally at the time, this is pre-COVID when I was there, they literally had QA, dev, operations, and the BU VP all sit in one conference room every Thursday afternoon at 5 p.m. And they were like, are we going to release this weekend? And every single one of them had to put a thumbs up, back to my joke about thumbs up earlier, thumbs up to say, yes, we're going to release. And when I saw those 5 thumbs up going, that means I was waking up at 3 in the fucking morning on Saturday to release the code. Well, obviously, if you're starting to release your code multiple times a day, that's not going to happen, right? You're not going to put a bunch of senior executives or senior leadership in a room to ask for thumbs up. I've experienced this firsthand, and the cloud native ecosystem goes in the face of that, because you're going to need to be able to trust your engineers to release code at the same time. And you'll need to build your pipeline and things like that too, but I'll get into more details momentarily. So JJ, are we doubling up on things? Like, I know there's a load balancer built inside of OpenShift, right? And there's a scheduler built. I mean, that's what Kubernetes is. It's a scheduler. Do we need a scheduler for our application anymore? Of course, you'll need to audit and verify that you aren't doubling up on your work. A great example with AsgharLabs is that they had a scheduler built into their Java application. They attempted to use Kubernetes to do the scheduling for their pods, or they didn't use they used their scheduler. Sorry, let me phrase. They use their schedule built inside their application. And then when they would spin off batch jobs during the day, it would spin up services inside of the pod and just start hammering that one pod with work. And they came to me, it's like, JJ, why we have a 3-node cluster. Why can't we seem to have all our load across the cluster? It's always just in one machine or one node. And then I asked them, like, well, are you leveraging the scheduler? They're like, yeah, we have a scheduler built in. I'm like, well, this isn't like a VM. You can't just, when you spin up another service, it stays inside that pod. You can't break that service outside of the pod unless you create a new pod with a new container and all that. They're like, oh. So that's the reason why all our machines all our clusters, they had multiple clusters, by the way, only had every usage of one machine. So they had to spend some time to understand how to break out that schedule service into another microservice, gave it its own container and own pod. So now when they send out the scheduled jobs to that microservice, it spins up other smaller pods across the cluster, and now everything starts working. And they've averaged out their load significantly. Admittedly, they've bought a lot of IKS, which is the IBM Kubernetes service. They weren't leveraging it correctly, but now they're actually using it, and flights are actually happening. I'm looking at you, flight company. That was kind of a joke, but it was actually serious. On the flip side, back to the load balancers. So who knows what an F5 is? Excuse me. We got one. Okay. F5 is a load balancer. It's a massive networking company. And they're basically the de facto standard when it comes to load balancer. You've probably spent, or you may have spent a lot of money on F5s. Well, if you move into the cloud native ecosystem, a lot of that feature functionality of the F5 is inside of OpenShift now, or inside of Kubernetes. So why would you need that extra hop now? So you need to spend the time and audit your already infrastructure to make sure you're not adding complexity when you don't need to. Hence, doubling up on work. So isn't automation good here? And honestly, why are everything so complicated? Really? Well, first of all, obviously automation is very good here. With all the moving parts, you'll need to leverage automation and let the computers do the work, because humans are squishy and error prone. And you want to take them out of the equation. And why is everything so complicated now? Honestly, they always probably have been this complicated, but no longer do you have one or two enterprise architects who know how your applications ran. Now you actually have visibility into your application. You'll be able to focus on the bottlenecks of your application too, and look for actual optimizations. And when you've truly gotten to microservices, you'll be amazed on the information you'll be able to actually understand how your business logic works and why, for the love of God, are we calling out to some random API we don't need to, and we can just bring that inside and save significant amounts of overhead. That was supposed to be a joke. To quote a great friend of mine, when I was talking about this talk, he basically said, JJ, you're telling me you had a ornery bull mastiff. Now you have 13 yipping chihuahuas. And that was from Robb Kid. Take a moment and think about it. Everyone knows what a bull mastiff is? It's a huge dog, right? And now you have chihuahuas. Everyone knows what a chihuahua is because Taco Bell. Well, you still got to feed them. You still got to walk them. But it is so much easier to deal with a chihuahua and have 12 hang out instead of one big bull mastiff. It's, yes, of course, you're going to have to walk 13 dogs instead of one now. But you can walk them in batches. It's a really great, it's a great way to compare and contrast what's going on. They require the same amount of effort, but now it's easier to deal with the smaller batches. It's the future, smaller batches. And to take another quote from another great friend of mine, Ken, we replaced our monolith with microservices, so every outage is now a murder mystery. Ken stole this from someone, who stole it from someone, who stole it from someone, and I'm stealing it from Ken. If something goes wrong, just as Ken stole this quote, it hits home, where now it really does become a murder mystery. If you don't take the moment to create shared logging, the ability to trace through your application, you don't have aggregated log monitoring. You will spend time and effort trying to understand what happens, because no longer is everything in the Catalina.out. It's now spread across every single application you have, or every single microservice. You'll have to walk through each process and what it did when. You'll become Sherlock Holmes before you realize it. Some people enjoy that. Other people wonder why you had an outage for 48 hours. Another joke. So let's ask about some questions you should ask about the cultural shift that will happen, because you will have a true cultural shift with your engineering teams. I mentioned that CCB earlier at AsgharLabs, and the CCB almost became something out of the Phoenix project. Has everyone read the Phoenix project? Has everyone read Eliyahu Goldrat's The Goal? Okay. Well, if you've never heard of that, excuse me. Basically, the Phoenix project is the IT version of The Goal. It's a very well done book, explains the nightmare that is operations in modern day technology. And the audiobook's really good too. So just saying, I used to listen to it going to sleep at night. So I'm going to reference it now, where that CCB became something out of the Phoenix project. No one showed up, or if they were showing up, it was just a burden. The idea that every week they had to come together and put their thumbs up to say, yes, we were going to go do that. With moving to cloud native, you naturally start allowing your self-orchestration. You start trusting your engineers to release code and doing rollouts and updates. You lean more and more on pipelines and collaboration to get different widgets out the door at the right time. And very importantly, you absolutely need to build that pipeline. You need to trust. I know we all say Jenkins, but it could be anything. It could be GitHub Actions, it could be Jenkins, it could be Circle CI, it doesn't matter. You just need to build a pipeline to do this. With that cultural shift, you will see this happen, and you'll need those CI and CD pipelines. You'll need to leverage the standards of linting and code in general, integration tests and unit tests, so you can always make sure there is a standardization. Did you have a question, sir? No, okay. One reason why Go is so easy to read is the Go format command, believe it or not. Go came along with a standard out of the box. So at 3 a.m. when your operations person is having a nightmare, wondering what the hell is going on with the production outage, they can just read the code. They don't have to use the cognitive overhead of why that semicolon is there, or what is going on, or tabs versus spaces. I know we all make those jokes constantly, but honestly, when your system is down and you're losing money, as an ex-DevOps engineer, or whatever you want to call me, if I had to spend the time to argue to make sure that I can't just read some code to understand what's happening at 3 a.m., that's wasted time. Just find a format, find a limit, a standardization that everyone writes to. It makes everyone's life so much easier. It's not just the syntax, but it's everything around it. But you start with linting and move forward from there. And that's what your first pipeline should be. Agree that we're all going to do tabs. Agree we're all going to do spaces or whatever, and just move on. It doesn't matter. Excuse me. The next thing is you need to learn to collaborate with other teams. The hardest thing I saw AsgharLabs deal with was the actual collaboration between teams. They had some great propaganda around having Scrum teams with tribes and bullshit like that. But nobody ever wanted to do it that. They always wanted to do it the old way. And collaboration isn't status meetings. It's not that daily stand-up you go to that you wonder why you're actually there. It's more than that. It's declaring shared contracts or for jobs and responsibilities with a constant communication between teams. Jira tickets can only get you so far. And one of the most successful things AsgharLabs ever did was every sprint, they took one engineer from one of those tribes and moved it to another tribe. Now take a moment and listen to what I just said there. That means every 2 weeks, you had new blood on your team. That means you have to be useful. They have to produce something every 2 weeks. So all of a sudden your documentation gets better because now you have to on-ramp that person basically at day one. Of course, it requires insane buy-in from your upper management because it slows down production or slows down creating features. But all of a sudden tribal knowledge disappears because all of a sudden Jane Doe and John Doe, they worked together 6 months ago on this project inside of this business unit, and they all know what their skills are and work together. No longer is it isolated. Now it's actually integrated between everything. And you know that turns out Mike Smith over there really does love databases, and he spends all his time playing around with databases. And it's luckily because I was working on that tribe with him 3 weeks ago or whatever. It opens up so many opportunities. This allowed to ramp so quickly. Yes, it took some time, admittedly, but now with a new hire, they actually know what's going on and produce very quickly. So with every single talk, you have to mention visibility and monitoring somehow. And AsgharLabs thought they could just buy one product and call it a day. I know there's some sponsors out there. I think I've seen a couple monitoring companies. They all want to sell you that single pane of glass. Well, unfortunately, and I use this with all love and support, Nagios isn't going to cut it anymore. Everyone knows who Nagios is? Yeah. We all know who Nagios is. And they learned this the hard way. Sometimes you're going to have multiple monitoring applications for visibility for only portions of your team, what your teams care about. As badly as AsgharLabs wanted that single pane of glass, it's unrealistic. And because there's so many moving parts now, back to the complication earlier. But it's always been this complicated, but now you can actually see where the complications are and start paying attention to. This is a huge cultural shift for a lot of enterprises out there and a lot of companies out there, because there's a couple of companies, and back to that airline, they thought they could just use this one monitoring solution and it would work for everything, not realizing that they had to monitor Kubernetes too. They couldn't just monitor their application. They need to understand what was happening on the clusters. Of course, there's some open source projects out there that do that too, but there's nothing wrong with running things in parallel, right? And honestly, that company is still dealing with this problem. And I really do hope one day they realize that, there are multiple options for this. So I'm going to take a quick aside from all this and talk about the economics. Because believe it or not, we can't do our jobs without our CFOs and our accounting teams. Never forget that. It's always fun to play with technology. Money's got to come in and money's got to go out. In the cloud, OpEx, everything's paid with a credit card now. We all know this. That's the whole advantage of the cloud ecosystem. You can just put it on a credit card and call it a day. But that's OpEx. And CFOs have problems with this. They go back and forth constantly. Some love it because assuming your team can keep control of your costs, you can predict how much you can spend over the next couple months, which is very opportunistic. But on the flip side, there's other CEOs that absolutely hate this because you can't depreciate the cloud. There's a lot of companies out there, Fortune 50 companies, that leverage depreciation for their accounting for GAAP, which is the general accounting acceptability practices, something like that. And depreciation is really, really important. And when all of a sudden their operations all disappear from that, it's a hard conversation to have with them. So hopefully you bring in your management and your team leads and whatnot and talk about those spend and what goes on there, because cloud native ecosystems can be very expensive, not data center expensive, but when you can't depreciate for a CFO, that's a much larger conversation to have. My throat is just killing me. JJ, what do you mean all our support's on Stack Overflow? Well, honestly, yeah, a few places probably is. Thanks, JJ. But yes, as you build the open source presence and start leveraging cloud native, you will leverage open source as, or sorry, Stack Overflow as your support engine. I mean, you'll be able to, you have to become part of the communities that you leverage. You're gonna have to spend the time and effort to understand why certain projects go certain ways. And the shortcut is yeah, you're gonna have to go to Stack Overflow to look for those answers. I mean, we're here at All Things Open right now. There's some Kubernetes committers, there's some OpenShift committers here. You're gonna have to find those people and interface with them to understand what the direction they're gonna go. So you can so you can make sure that it fills in with your business processes and your business goals. So I shortcut it by saying Stack Overflow, but it really should be like every community out there. You get the point. So let's talk about some tangible things you can start with to hopefully help make you more successful as you go down this path. There's a ton of technology and software to help you get going. But the best thing you can do is take a moment and figure out when you containerized your app, did you really containerize it, or did you just wrap it into a pod and wash your hands of it? Have a large conversation about why you did this. Was it because you wanted not to left? Was it because you didn't want to be left behind, like AsgharLabs? Or was it because you thought you could leverage someone's software to make a better value for your customers? So I realize I have a little bit more time, but I'm going to go ahead and conclude now because my throat is truly killing me. So hopefully, ideally, with masking all these corporations that I've had exposure to as AsgharLabs, has helped highlight some of these consistent issues that I've seen. And the best thing you can do is this. First, ask if you really needed to. And if you've already committed, well, you probably need to take a beat and look for the optimizations instead of features. As much as you want to roll out features to get ahead of your competition, you need to leverage optimizations before doing that. This will drive your teams crazy, drive your management crazy. But the more you pay up front, the more you use the correct tool for the job, the better you'll get. Or another quote friend of mine, Cate, you wouldn't use a saw when you needed a hammer, or a hammer when you needed a saw, right? Take a moment and think about that. I can take a hammer and break a piece of wood. I'll look like an idiot, but I can do it. Or I can take a saw and hit a nail down, hammering it down. I'll look like an idiot, but I can do it. So really, really take a moment and make sure that you're choosing the right thing. Thank you. Can I answer any questions? I'm a Pisces. I watch a lot of Netflix, yes. Yeah. The question was, when you move from Monolith to microservice or to cloud native, are things more Googleable? So you can actually no longer need to go to some expertise inside of your business. Now you can actually use the community to help you understand something. And absolutely, because there's de facto best practices out there already with all this stuff. And as you start moving to the microservices and whatever framework you decide to use, there's already communities that have already figured out the best path for that. So instead of you going over to, Grandpa Bob over there that understands how everything comes together, now you're leveraging people inside the community and actually being able to work with them to make your product even more secure and stable. Did I answer your question? Awesome. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so your question is how do you deal with the reluctance from enterprises to move from monolithic to microservices? And do they use IBM products to do it? Well, of course they use IBM Cloud to be successful. But in all seriousness, that goes back to my question, why? why do you need to move to microservices? Like, it takes a lot of engineering effort to do it. Yes, there's some products inside of IBM to make life a little bit easier, but as a company, as a decision makers, you need to ask why and is it worth it? Because right now, to run a Kubernetes cluster, like a production level Kubernetes cluster, right now, if you do not use something like OpenShift and use vanilla Kubernetes, you are going to spend in just human capital to run it, you need at least 5 engineers. And we're talking about $250K a year per engineer. So that's $1.2 million a year in just humans to run a Kubernetes cluster. Now, that's just to run it. Imagine all the engineering effort to move it to that, right? So as you start looking at actually the economics of it, if you're already making money with a monolithic application, do the next application as microservices and start from the ground up there instead of migrating it. Again, ask, why are we doing this? Do we actually need to do this? Did I answer your question? Awesome. What else can I answer? I just finished Ted Lasso. That was pretty good. All right, well, thanks y'all. And please never hesitate to reach out if I can help.